From the archives of the great library of Arathes, golden city of elves, the wise scholars of Grey Sage present the unlikely and highly questionable accounts from those who were avowed witness. These are the suspenseful investigations of the human, Fraenk Neversleep, Arch-Preceptor of Blackroot. And now, the Neversleep Scrolls, Circle of the Mind Thief, written by Philip Walton. The story continues. Chapter 36. For a long moment, Lady Blackroot gave him a pinched look, which seemed to suggest she was preparing to use whatever life remained to her in order to beat senseless whatever life remained of Fraenk.
"Burning hells,"
she said finally, then sighed.
"I must admit it was not a bad contingency. I should know better than to underestimate you, Neversleep."
If we pass through that mist, they're going to uncover our deception, and we'll have some uncomfortable questions to answer. He didn't add anything about their earlier escapade of impersonating the arch-partisan himself in order to break a thief out of custody, but the knowing look that passed between himself and Gwen said everything. "We need to get her out of here without being obvious about it," he concluded. Fraenk shot a quick look over at arch-partisan Brightrock and his guards, who were now ushering more dignitaries and guests through the glamour-stopping cloud, including some of Blackroot's own elite. Some waved or bowed to Lady Blackroot, while others gave confused glances in their direction. All of this was calling some very unwanted attention to them. Fraenk had to do something. He was just about to propose a half-formed idea when Lady Blackroot suddenly began to raise her voice and shout,
"What do you mean you don't have it, Neversleep?"
she shrieked, drawing surprised looks from everyone around them, none more surprised than Fraenk himself. I... Neversleep began to stammer.
"I told you 3 times not to forget, but what do you do?"
"I apologize, my lady." Fraenk picked up her cue and began to follow.
"Well, don't just stand there. Go and get it. It's probably back at the estate, yes?"
She clutched her hands in exasperation. Several of the nearby lords and even a few servants gave bemused smiles at this sudden dramatic outburst. Fraenk started to turn, but she grabbed his sleeve.
"No! You stay here. I'll send someone competent this time. Credell, go and fetch us our invitation to the gala, and be quick about it."
Lady Blackroot grabbed the young brown-eyed guard and shoved him forth. He gave a curt bow, an eye roll to Fraenk, and then took off in a sprint back down the 3-part drawbridge. The whole farce was crude but effective. Brightrock and his partisans already seemed to have had their attention drawn back to another not-so-young elf, who was finding his own chiselled square jaw going soft, and his toned body was now puffing out of his tailored clothing like so much rising bread dough. "They'd never keep you out for a lack of invite," Fraenk said to Lady Blackroot, keeping his head low in a display of contrition.
"Oh, but you forget. I'm just a confused old woman,"
she replied, head raised and shoulders back. Her dignity was ironclad.
"If you let them underestimate you, because of who you are, it's better than any glamour."
Just then, a loud clattering sounded from the bridge as a team of 6 massive black horses came drawing an opulent long carriage up to the entrance. Its polished black wood was embellished with silvery green leaves coming off in long looping strands. On its door was the familiar sigil of their recent nemesis, House Fernbrook. The carriage halted and footmen pulled open the double doors. Since the sun was already low on the horizon, it made the coach dark inside. But Fraenk already knew who would soon be emerging.
"Lord Farathiel Gingerglade, Arch-Preceptor of House Fernbrook,"
the servant announced as the spymaster stepped out first to a tepid applause that rivaled what even Fraenk received. While it could have been a general disdain for this loathsome gutter rat, the crowd's reaction seemed to be more a general bewilderment to Gingerglade's ensemble. Instead of the ostentatious formal robes that everyone else had on, he was dressed incongruously understated for this event. While it did have the gold-stitched Fernbrook sigil large on the chest, the rest seemed barely enough to be considered formal, but it lacked any of the form-fitting lines and restrictive collars, which was to be expected for a gala. It was blossomed and roomy at the body joints, which gave a rather comical, almost jester-like appearance. One might assume that the Acheron of ceremonies in Fernbrook was negligent in his duties, preparing this poor elf for the gala. But Frank's trained eye saw a much darker purpose for Gingerglade's attire. He had on a suit built for movement. He was most certainly up to something. Fraenk watched him smile at those around him. Smug like he had a secret that no one else knew about. Like he was getting away with a crime right before their very eyes, and they were too stupid to recognize it. Something impish came over him then. He didn't know if they would be able to stop Fernbrook's scheme. The city itself might be left wide-eyed and gape-mouthed at the end when the dust had settled and Fernbrook stood victorious over them all. But the voice inside, the one that sometimes sounded like Mycon but now was sounding a lot more like his own mother, that voice was telling him not to stop, not to quit, not to give up. And if Gingerglade thought he may just gloat over everyone for their having failed to uncover the deception, Fraenk Neversleep wanted him to know that he wasn't so easily tricked. There was one fool here, and Fraenk wanted everyone to know it. "Lord Gingerglade, will you be entertaining everyone with some tumbling later? Perhaps some capers or juggling?" Fraenk called out. A burst of laughter went up from the crowd. Fraenk turned red-faced, craning his neck to see who had insulted him. The laughter would have continued if not for the loud voice of the head servant, nearly screaming over the top of the noise.
"Lord Malgrave Fernbrook, High Lord of Fernbrook District and honoured guest of tonight's High Lord's Gala."
Applause and cheers went up from those gathered around the entrance as all watched a thin, elegant elf with swept-back silver hair and high cheekbones step from the carriage. Lord Fernbrook did indeed look stately, but he had a pervasive curl to his nose that made him appear as if the entire world had a smell that offended his nostrils. So here was the elf who had casually condoned the murder of his friend Mycon the baker, for no better reason than he was in the way of the elf's ambitions. Fraenk watched him with an icy glare as he strode forth toward the palace entrance.
What's this honoured guest business?
He heard Lady Blackroot mutter under her breath.
The other lords will not be pleased, I assure you.
Several burly personal guards also stepped forward from the carriage. Fraenk thought he recognized the one with curly orange hair and a fading bruise on his cheek, but he couldn't be sure. The guards quickly encircled Lord Fernbrook as he approached the entrance, scattering the lesser elves who were already there.
How can he get through with the necklace?
Lady Blackroot whispered the question that was already in Frank's mind. They soon had their answer as Lord Fernbrook and his entire entourage, including Gingerglade, moved through the blue vapour without incident. "He doesn't have it on him." Frank's brow furrowed. "He's smuggling in the mind thief some other way."
"Is there a problem, my Lady Blackroot?"
The simpering head servant asked when they approached. Fraenk could tell that as much as this snobbish and bitter elf might privately enjoy the scorn and public humiliation of a human, his duties were to keep the guests flowing in and not to foul their evening before it began.
It seems my servant here has forgotten my official invitation,
she said in exaggerated annoyance.
"So hard to find decent help these days."
He preened, giving Fraenk a side-eye.
"I won't even allow a human on staff here for just those very reasons. Besides, they die of old age before you can even get them properly trained."
He tittered at his own wit, and Lady Blackroot obliged him with a tight smile.
"Of course your invite isn't necessary. You and your underling are welcome guests of High Lord Whiteleaf."
It was not lost on Fraenk how the servant slipped into Elvish when he used their word for peon. He clapped his hands, and a nearby elf who had surprisingly wide shoulders and a strong jawline stepped forward and held out gloved hands. With practiced ease, this escort hooked his hands under her arm and at the small of her back, drawing her toward the entrance in sort of a dancer's embrace. It was completely ostentatious and excessive, and made Fraenk renew his vow to not leave this party until he'd skewered any or all of these pretentious skarks with some type of dining utensil. Fraenk followed a pace behind as the group of them passed through the Arcane Lord's magical blue mist. He felt prickly cool on his skin as they went through, and the air smelled faintly of lavender, as well as another, more bitter scent. Fraenk kept his eyes down so as to avoid any unintentional eye contact with arch-partisan Brightrock, should he be nearby. His caution was unnecessary, however, as Brightrock was already far up the wide path of the grounds that lead past the many fantastically carved topiaries in the shapes of mythological beasts and into the palace itself. Soon they all were moving along it and towards the magnificent structure ahead. Entering the grounds of the monarch's summer palace, Fraenk wanted nothing more than to hate this place. It was a shining beacon to their supposed benevolent protectors, these elves who lived for centuries and believed they were personally blessed by the Lin-Tyrians themselves. And yet, for all their claims of virtue, even putting their own lives at peril to fight wars in the name of peace and justice, they still spoke with open disdain for humans and allowed the absolute squalor of Kobold Town. How could they be such a powerful force against evil in other parts of the world and be blind to the suffering within their very walls? But here in the Summer Palace, he had his answer. Fraenk found himself impossibly, and in spite of every negative feeling he could muster against the elves, in awe. The palace was an absolute wonder of architecture, art and engineering all working together in a beautiful harmony that seems to have in many ways improved upon the rugged mountain top where it was constructed. Every line, every curve and surface placed with a purpose and to evoke a feeling. The use of space was deliberate and organic. Fraenk could even make out where foundations and walls of the previous fortifications were now flawlessly merged with the palace as an apparent physical embodiment of their eternal glory and their assuredness of that conviction. And who would argue with the ones who could summon divine power to destroy their enemies on the battlefield? When they were less than a dozen steps from the palace's tall doors, Lady Blackroot extracted her arm from the elf's grip.
I think I can find my way from here,
she said irritably and sent the elf servant away. She turned to find Fraenk staring up in sheer wonder at the main palace, or rather the entrance to the wing that contained the ballroom.
Close your gop, Neversleep. It's just a building,
Lady Blackroot said, pulling him off to one side before they could enter. Her expression had gone serious, and he could read worry in her eyes.
Once we go inside, I am no longer your friend, I am your master. You must guard your tongue and show deference to your betters, which in this place is pretty much everyone. Now, I too must pay my respects to Lord Whiteleaf, and during the gala I will be seated amongst the elders, so you will be on your own.
Are you warning me not to get into trouble? Fraenk asked.
Neversleep, I've always trusted you to do what must be done. But I'm warning that if you get put in a spot here, there's not a thing I can do to save you. I won't even try.
There was no malice in her voice, just a simple statement of fact. How many times had she shielded him, protected him, saved him? Not just in these past few weeks, but ever since he came into her service? Fraenk didn't know why exactly, but he meant something to her. My lady, that arcane lord's counter-magic cloud has given us a chance. It's forced Fernbrook to get the necklace in by some other means. I believe that Gingerglade will be the one to retrieve it. If I can intercept it...
Then waste no more time talking to me, Fraenk.
She gave him a smile that was almost gentle, wordless with the layers of significance that one person could mean to another. Then Lady Blackroot took the arm of her remaining guard, and they moved into the grand ballroom. Fraenk reached for the bottle in his cloak and found that he had neither. In his current outfit, he was carrying less than when he was disguised as a monk, no knives or bottles or tinctures of any kind. He felt a hard lump in his breast pocket and realized he was still carrying the small brass flame-starting device given to him by Valthor. Somehow it had not alerted the arcane lord as a weapon, or even as being magical. It was a defective gadget after all, and probably not of much use. But he still had his wits, and that would have to be enough. Fraenk fell in behind a procession of brightly and theatrically dressed elves of Lord Hocken Sweetrose's entourage. Amongst their number he was hardly noticed at all as he slipped inside the grand ballroom of the summer palace. Fraenk found Fraenk Gingerglade right away amongst the crowd in his buffoonish clothing. He appeared deep into a tale of daring with a group of bored-looking elven maidens who all looked hopeful for the story's conclusion. Fraenk would need to wait for him to slip away. That would be the sign that their plan to collect the necklace was unfolding. What did surprise him was to see Doran Leafwater here, and unlike Gingerglade, he was surrounded by a large cluster of mesmerized elves who were entranced and hanging off his every word. The vile beast was mortally wounded, but still it sought my blood. So I cranked back the ballista again, and just as it lunged, mouth open to swallow me whole, I fired, Doran dramatized, acting out this confabulated tale to the transfixed audience. They squealed excitedly as he reached the story's climax. "Hey! Looks like you made it out just fine, Leafwater." Fraenk chuckled to himself. A small orchestra was set up where the room curved into a natural concave shape to project sound out into the ballroom. They were well into the third movement of a famous elven waltz as Fraenk entered. He watched for a moment, transfixed as dancers capered and swirled to the music, switching partners and returning back, bowing and raising delicate hands into the air, all in beautiful unison. There was joy on their faces and blissful abandon. It reminded him of his ill-fated excursion into Kobold Town, before it all went to chard and they had to run for their lives. It was not in the contrasts between the elves and kobolds, but how much they were alike. Here was music and dancing, the joyous faces. How similar they all were when it came right down to it. At the soul of each was someone who wanted to enjoy a song, step lively in a dance, to eat, and perhaps even to love. But then it all seemed so ridiculous. Could he even imagine elves dancing in the mud around a smoking cook-fire, or kobolds dressed in finery curtsying to the High Lord here in the Summer Palace? He scoffed at such a preposterous thought. Then again, hadn't Kyla found favour and kinship in the kobold Possu? And she was a Lindblood, which put her in a status even above elves. If someone like her could find something worthy in the lowliest creature that most others still considered to be monsters, what did any of this mean? Was it all artifice to keep elves in power and make sure the likes of humans, dwarvenkind and kobolds always in the mud? This was the place, after all. The Summer Palace, formerly the outpost where the elves stood and fired their terrible ballistas down on humans. Fraenk knew the damage those weapons could do on a shade scourge, let alone a human. The reminders were everywhere, reinforcements of elven superiority. Even now he could see it, not carved into the walls as a subtle bas-relief, but a huge painting hung on a wall. The siege of Arathes rendered in all its glory, from the perspective of brave elves standing on the ramparts with bows and siege weapons. In the painting they didn't look like heroes, they looked like gods. Frank's throat suddenly felt very dry. An odd dizziness hit him, and he could feel his heart thundering in his chest. He knew exactly what it required in such a situation. The answer was the liquid there in tall bottles, behind a suave, brown-haired elf that was serving at the counter. With a thin sheen of sweat beginning to form on his brow, Fraenk weaved through the crowd in the most direct path over, while still keeping an eye on Fraenk Gingerglade. The server quirked an eyebrow upon seeing his approach. There were already tall flutes of a clear, sparkly wine set out for guests to take as they liked, but Fraenk ignored them entirely. "What's in those?" Fraenk asked directly, pointing to the tantalizing row of ornate decanters, each with a different colour of intoxicant, from dark brown, amber, almost blood red, to perfectly clear, any one of which could quench this thirst. "Those!" The server's mouth playfully curled up at one corner. "Oh, you wouldn't like those, they're intense." "That sounds exactly what I'm looking for," Fraenk replied. "Splash one out and we'll see how it bends." The server stepped back and seemed to size Fraenk up for a moment before making some internal decision. He pulled the bottle of bronze-coloured liquid and issued a healthy pour into a crystalline glass. He slid it toward Fraenk, a look of challenge on his face. Fraenk took the glass in hand, inspected the liquor, gave it a swirl and then a smell. It was smoky and warm. He took a tentative sip and all the sound seemed to go out of the room. It was perhaps the best booze he'd ever tasted. Fraenk downed the remainder with a gulp. When he looked up, the server seemed in awe because he had backed away wide-eyed and then gave a deep, deferential bow. "If you think that's impressive, you should see me with a bottle of the cheap stuff. This is good, by the way. Very good. I'll have another," Fraenk said, setting the glass on the bar top. The server didn't move, however, just continued to stare at the floor. Fraenk eyed him curiously. Then he noticed how quiet the entire room was. The small orchestra had stopped playing and no one seemed to be speaking. Then Fraenk felt something touch his ear. 2 warm fingers had gripped the helix of his outer ear and were rubbing against it. Someone was behind him, and they were feeling his skin. An immediate revulsion hit him. A deep and primal instinct shot up like a lightning bolt from a black corner of his brain. Fraenk didn't think, he just reacted. Pivoting, he wheeled quickly, slapping away the hand. "Get your skarking hands off me!" Fraenk started to shout, but then stopped when he realized just whose hand it was. Although he had never seen him before, there could be no mistaking the regally dressed elf with the golden sigil of pale foliage who now stood opposite him. It was the Watcher of the Pale, Warden of the West, His Royal Eminence, the Elven High Lord, Crispin Whiteleaf. Thank you for listening. Tune in next week for another exciting episode. And remember, the learned scholars of Grey Sage caution you that the veracity of these events remains unproven. Now go safe in the light of the powers, until our hands clasp again.